So I think I'm going to start to be mindful of everyone's time and make sure that we have enough time to go through the presentation that we have for everyone this afternoon from the CMF, and then also take questions. So thank you again for everyone for making time out of your afternoon to be with us in this virtual space today. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting before virtually or perhaps somewhere in person, my name is Tamara Marion McDowett, and I am the Vice President of Growth and Inclusion at the Canada Media Fund. For reference, for anyone else who's joining who may be visually impaired, I'm a Black woman, I'm wearing glasses, I have curly hair, a purple sweater, and I'm sitting in an office in front of a wall of a lot of black and white photos. I'm also joined today by a number of my coworkers within the CMF. Here we have Emmanuel, Emily, Pierre, and Diego, who can again introduce themselves more thoroughly later on if they take part and speak in this presentation. And as well, I would like to welcome to this session our two ASL interpreters who are also here with us this afternoon. I do also want to start off by acknowledging the fact that we are joined today by participants from across the country. And I would invite you, if you want to acknowledge where you're from in the chat, to feel free to do that at any point. I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous people who are and continue to be the caretakers of this land. Today, I'm joining from Tekaronto, which for thousands of years has been the gathering place of Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, as well as the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I will also recognize that this land is home to the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade and others who have arrived here through forced displacement or seeking asylum from unsafe homes. Many of us are descendants from people who have arrived here by choice and have benefited from the displacement and forced assimilation of Indigenous peoples, which continues to this day. From coast to coast to coast to coast, we recognize the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this land home. As I mentioned, if you want to acknowledge where you're joining from, feel free to do this. I also want to again point out that we do have ASL interpretation throughout this webinar today, and that if you need any sort of technical support at any time during this conversation, you can use the chat function to raise those questions or concerns, and then we can assist you in that manner as well. I'm going to go through first a deck about the sector development program, and then we're going to use the last half of the meeting or so to take any questions. If you do have questions that come to mind at any point during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A function to raise those questions. And then as mentioned, we'll come to them at the end of the session. And I do also want to point out, because I know often people can be confused about the intention and who the sector development program is open to and accessible to. And I noticed that there's a number of content creators and producers who have joined this call today. So I wanted to start with the warning and the caveat right off the top from the beginning that sector development is a program that is only open to nonprofit, Canadian controlled organizations or institutions. So if you are here representing a for-profit production company, unless you are a volunteer or also a staff person or a board member of a nonprofit organization, this unfortunately is probably not the information session or program that will be relevant to you. But if you want to stay on the call and listen in, please feel free to do that. So without any further opening remarks, I will ask Diego to put up the deck, and we'll go through the general overview of the sector development program as it is for the 2022-23 fiscal year. Diego, we can jump ahead to the next slide, please. One back. Thank you so much. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to go over today is very similar to what you'll find in the guidelines on our website. but I think, sometimes it's helpful and easier to hear from us and from the rest of the staff at the CMF what we actually mean behind these words, and to really highlight some of the key things about this program to help people digest our intention and how we can work with industry partners who are intending to apply to this program. So I really want to start off with the nature of the spirit and intent and why we have sector development. This is really our one funding instrument that through the CMF can work with industry organizations, and that we can use funding to support programs that lead to change, growth, development, capacity building, all of these things within the Canadian screen sector. I think one of the other big things that's important when you think about eligibility, and this again relates to why production companies are not eligible applicants in this stream, is that we're looking for projects that benefit multiple members of the screen sector. So that also, means a good way to think about it is multiple separate copyright holders. That could mean a program where producers from many different companies are being trained, where content creators from a variety of different streams are all being supported to go to an international market. But I think the sort of good litmus test of eligibility is that there are these multiple separate copyright holders who are receiving tangible benefits from the program, be that tangible benefits in relation to being able to track growth financially, sort of as business outputs, if you're a producer or a production company, or perhaps also benefits in terms of capacity building, education, knowledge, networking, connection. So that's sort of the big overarching caveat in terms of the spirit and intent of the program. I think the other big thing is that this program has a huge overarching focus on underrepresented communities. And if Diego can turn to the next slide, we can look at specifically which groups we're targeting within this program. So, and a lot of the groups that are here from a variety of equity and sovereignty seeking communities very closely align to the groups that are able to access different types and other diversity incentives in other programs within the CMF. So these are Indigenous, Black, and people of color, individuals who identify as women, people with disabilities, the two SLGBTQ+ communities, official language minority communities, so that means Anglophones living and working within Quebec, or Francophones outside of Quebec, and also regional communities, which are those that are outside of the key centers of Montreal and Toronto. I think another big thing with this program is, yes, we do prioritize applicants who come from organizations that are governed and controlled and mandated to produce programming for any of these diverse communities. We do also allow other screen sector organizations, of course, to apply into this program, but we then will ask to be able to understand how you're working with organizations, leaders, institutions that represent any of these equity or sovereignty seeking communities. So we want to be able to see those close connections. And we also want to be able to understand whether projects that are being proposed have an intersectional approach. So do we perhaps have a regional organization that's trying to work with a Black organization and they've perhaps applied as a cohort? Do we have a OLMC organization that's collaborating with an organization to represent people with disabilities, and so on and so forth? So we're always looking for how people are working together across the screen sector. Diego, we can go to the next slide, please. Great, so I apologize. Yes, there is a specific focus within this program for us to understand how the needs are being met of the specific regional or benefiting through the program. Another key caveat in making sure the initiative you're applying with is eligible is to look at the types of content that the CMF funds and to make sure that the types of content creators who are participating in or benefiting from your proposed program also relate back to that. So that means people working with broadcast television content or people working in the interactive or immersive media industries, Oftentimes we do get applications for projects that relate more to feature-length theatrical films or short films, but that's really not something in the wheelhouse of the type of work we would be supporting through this program. So I think that's really helpful to keep in mind. We also have a huge focus in sector development on export. And this is where I mentioned earlier the idea of tangible benefits that may relate to business, sales, new industry connections, ways to help Canadian production companies expand into new markets, ways for B2B and matchmaking activities. Really, how are we growing and our revenues and exporting our Canadian content to the world? This is a focus that I'll talk about again a little bit later in the deck. And as well, the program continues to have a focus on supporting producers. This is really an opportunity for the CMF to work closely with industry to build a robust pipeline of stabilized and able-bodied producers and production companies who at the end of the day are primarily the applicants to the CMF. So that's why there is, again, a close connection here with supporting producers, both those who are emerging and also those who are mid-career. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, we really encourage applications that are collaborative in nature. So cross-sector, screen sector organizations working together, or also things that are collaborative in terms of how they're addressing the intersectionalities within communities in the screen sector. Diego, the next slide, please. So this is what I mentioned off the top of the call. And this is a big important thing to pay attention to. If you are a company that is able to apply for funding in any of the content funding streams with the CMF, then sector development is not the program for you. We are open to nonprofit Canadian incorporations who have mandates to focus on the screen sector. So this largely means research, think tanks that are focused on the screen sector, film festivals, art service organizations, training institutions, things in those sort of areas of work. Those are the eligible applicants to this program. But certainly if you have questions about that as it relates to an organization you may be working with, you can certainly reach out and clarify the eligibility with us. Diego, thank you. So it is also important to talk about how persona ID relates to applications to sector development. And this is certainly something we can pick up in greater detail in the Q&A at the end of the chat, but we do need to use persona ID to understand the identities of the individuals who are in the governance of the applicant organization and also the leaders of the organization who are implementing the program. If you are coming from a screen sector organization that is identifying as being led or governed by members of any of the equity or sovereignty seeking communities I referred to earlier in the deck. Diego? Thank you. So this is a big change I wanted to discuss to the program for this year that was not in the program last year. So for people who have perhaps previously applied in the past, this is, I think, the big change this year to be aware of. We've streamlined the program so that when you apply, you have 3 separate sort of components or doorways within sector development that you can submit projects through, and you can also stack them together. So you could come in and tell us you only have a project that's research, or you could come in with a project that's a mix of capacity building and market access. But I'll take a bit of time to talk through what we mean in these 3 distinct areas. Capacity building is really focused on things where there's an educational or learning output that can be tracked through the program. So be that mentorship, professional development, any other sort of training that may be offered in person or virtually in a lab session. Those are generally the things we see coming in through the capacity building component. And then, of course, research is a big and important area, which may relate to actual research studies or reports, or this may also relate to best practice publications. But again, it's all to do with topics of relevance to the screen sector. And then lastly is market access or export. So this is an opportunity for screen sector organizations to ask for funding for really one of three areas. This could be an inbound export market event. So you may tell us you're having a event in Alberta and you need to bring in decision makers from certain key international markets to have matchmaking with the Canadian delegates. You may be doing a domestic B2B event, perhaps in Quebec City, and you're curating meetings with broadcasters only coming in from Quebec or other parts of Canada. Or this could also be something like an outbound export mission. If you're taking a delegation of Canadian producers with content that's ready to export, perhaps to IDFA or to the Gotham market in the US, or, we're really open. We want people to apply and explain to us what markets, what decision makers, what types of connections are most relevant and needed for the communities that you're trying to support through your project. So we've broken this out into these three components. And when we turn a little bit later in the presentation to the application, you'll also see how that breakdown has hopefully helped to streamline the questions we're asking applicants to only be relevant depending on which type of component you're coming in to apply with. Diego, I'm good to go to the next slide. So the money, this is probably the part everyone always wants to know the most about. I think the key important things here is this is a grant, so it's not repayable to the CMF. The funding caps, if you are an organization with a national reach and your project has a national reach, then the maximum amount you can request in one fiscal year is 100,000. And again, remember, this could be stacked across different components. So you could be an organization that's doing a thing nationally, which for us really means in multiple places and benefiting people from multiple regions across Canada. It could be a request of 50,000 for research and another 25,000 on top of that, perhaps for an export mission. It's really up to the organizations to decide which components are meaningful with the type of work that they're trying to do. And if you're a regional, a provincial, or a municipal focused organization, then the cap you can come into for the year is 50,000. I think the other thing that's a change in the program this year is that we're not funding projects at 100%. So we will fund up to 75% of the costs in your eligible budget, but that does mean that applicants need to come up with the remaining 25% from another partner, which could be a foundation, another corporation, or a government fund. It's really up to you. And I would always suggest that your application will be stronger if you have already confirmed that other matching 25% of the budget. And if you haven't, it's always good to give us some notes and details about where you are at with those negotiations and when you expect to hear about the remainder of your budget being approved. Diego, we can switch. Great. So now I'm going to talk a bit about the application process for this year. Great. So we have two deadlines in this year, and we'll come to those a little bit later in the application, but we've also tried to change the process through which organizations are applying in the attempt to actually make it easier, because I know that we ask for a lot of information in the application process, and we want to try to streamline this. So it is really only applicants with a project that the CMF feels it's highly likely that we would approve because we feel that it's eligible and that it's at the right stage to apply, that will actually let you come in with a full application. So starting in this year, really the first step of engagement in putting forward an application is to send us a letter of intent, so that you've given us a one-page summary with the sort of high-level details about your project, who you are, who the project will be benefiting, whether it's a specific equity or sovereignty-seeking community, whether it's only benefiting writers or editors or producers, the cost of the project, who else is involved in the project, and what is the need? Why are you doing this? What are the outputs you're expecting? So that then we can review this and book a meeting and have a conversation to understand where you are at with the project. And this also helps us to make sure that we've had conversations with applicants to clearly discuss our expectations in terms of the level of detail when you move into the full application. So we ask that these letters of intent come in at least 6 weeks ahead of the deadline so that that gives us time to review them. And we're open to start, reviewing these applications as of today. So when people are ready, they can start sending them in. You don't have to wait until 6 weeks ahead of the first deadline, but we do want to go through this process of having sort of a closer connection pre-reviewing the full application with the applicants. And this is really designed to help us understand your intention in applying and also help the applicants with being ready to prepare an application and also preparing an application when the project is at the right stage to be put forward to us. Diego, the next slide. Great, thank you. So the way to apply, if you've gone through the letter of intent stage and you've been cleared, and we will communicate that back through email that we would like you to move forward with the full application. Then you'll move into putting together both the narrative application package to the CMF and as well the financial details through the budget form. And both of those are things that we have templates for, and we do require that you use our templates because we do want to make sure that what we're comparing across applications, everyone's answered the same questions and given us the same types of information. So the deadlines for this fiscal year are July 15th and November 18th. As I mentioned, you do need to send in the letter of intent 6 weeks ahead. So if you're thinking of coming into the deadline in July, that letter of intent deadline would be in the first week of June. But again, we're open to taking those letters of intent as soon as organizations are ready to put them forward. Diego, I'm good for the next slide. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the application content. Perfect. So the application, the narrative application, is broken into 2 separate sections. This section, which is information for all applicants, is the same. And then the subsequent sections I'll talk about differ a little bit depending on which component you're applying to within sector development. So for everyone off the top, we need to know the profile of the organization. And I think this is an important thing because sometimes organizations will assume that we know everything about you, assume we know nothing, especially because these files are adjudicated by staff across the CMF. So even if you've spoken to myself or someone else in my team and we know who you are, the other people who are reading your application may not. So this is when you can really give us details about yourself, your successes, and all of those things. And I think people should not be humble in telling us about who they are. Also, we want to have an understanding of COVID. This is specifically important for any applications that may be suggesting they're having travel. So perhaps export applications or applicants who are proposing to do things in person, perhaps labs or workshops. We just want to understand what COVID policies the organization may have and how they're thinking of dealing with any changes that may need to happen over the course of delivering the program. And then the other thing we want everyone to tell us about off the top is if you have any other partners, and this is specifically important, perhaps if there's another partner who is a financial contributor to the project, or if you're working with a new community or in a different part of the country and you have partners that you're delivering the whole program with, or perhaps a specific element with, this is where we want to have those details. So we have all of this information clear off the top. Diego, the next slide, please. Great, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over really what is the meat of the narrative application. And these questions are the same if you're coming in for a capacity building training type program, or if you're coming in for a market access program. There's only a really small nuanced detail between how the questions are phrased in both components. Right off the top, we want to understand the results you're expecting, because a lot of the way that we will adjudicate these files is to have an understanding of who the audience is that your organization is proposing to work with, why they need the thing that you're proposing to do, and then what is the result output that you're expecting at the end. What is the change that's being offered, the learning growth, the new business skills, the new business connections, the financial impacts for the audience. So that's why we start right off the top with, please let us know details about the results that you are expecting to be able to deliver on through the proposed project. Then the other big piece here is the project details. And I would say that this is an area where people often fall down and don't do well. We want a lot of detail here, and we want the detail to be prepared in advance. So if you're proposing a lab and the lab is going to teach people about 3 specific topics, you need to give us the details of, is this a lab that takes place over 15 days? Great. What is the content between, if the lab runs every day from 9 to 5, what is the proposed schedule on day 1 through to day 15? What are the topics being covered? What are the learning outputs within those topics? And who are the people that you have identified from your community or other communities who are the experts, the mentors, the leaders who will then train and teach on that content? Yes, we understand that, you may propose a teacher and the person may change between the 6 months of when we review and when you start the thing, but we want to have the understanding that you've, as an organization, have been able to take the time to work out the full curriculum, the full format and content of whatever the thing is, because that helps us to understand how it relates to your audience and their needs, and how these specific trainers or these specific content elements then relate to the results that you're proposing you'll be able to achieve. The difference, I would say, if you're applying into market access, is you're not telling us how many labs we're having on topics A, B, and C, but you're now telling us, we're expecting to have 25 participants, and each participant will do 10 meetings with these types of people. And then you're going to give me your proposed delegate list. Who are the decision makers, the broadcast buyers, the sales agents, the distributors, whoever it is that you're curating meetings with through your inbound or outbound export market or B2B meetings. Those are the details of the project that we need to have a clear understanding about, because all of this helps us understand the content, and I think also the feasibility. So again, the third point here is audience. So this is really, who is going to benefit from the program and why they need it. And I think another important thing we ask about here in the application is how you've chosen them. Because one of the big differences between sector development and perhaps, organizations that receive sponsorship money through the CMF is that sector development programs are highly curated. So that means you've had some sort of description of who is eligible to come into the program, who is eligible to partake in an export mission, and you're going to have some sort of process within your team, within your organization staff, or within a third-party jury who's going to adjudicate who is at the right stage in their career to benefit from the thing, versus perhaps a conference panel that is open to anyone who shows up, and it's not heavily curated towards audiences that are part of our screen sector here in Canada. Evaluation reporting, we want to understand how you're going to monitor your project and how you're going to be able to track the results that you're proposing the project will have. I think a good thing here to remember is that if you have costs related to evaluating your project, put them in the budget. I think applicants often forget that. But that for us is an important piece of doing this work. And we want to see that the work is evaluated, that the CMF can learn from what you've learned from your evaluation. And you can also learn as an organization from how the project has gone, what to tweak, what to change, if it's something that's returnable that you're doing year in and out. And then the last 2 things we want to understand is the timeline. What is the schedule of when all of these things will happen? And who are the people who are actually implementing the project? I think sometimes we get confused between who the project team is and who the organization is and what is the organization's history. Sometimes it's the same people, but sometimes it's quite different. And if there's a specific person in your staff or perhaps a contractor or consultant that you're going to engage to deliver on a key part of the program, that's where we want to understand who they are and why they're relevant and a strong fit for the specific project. So Diego, we can turn to the next page, and I think I'll let Pierre give a little bit of overview in terms of the application details for research projects.
Yes, hello, thanks, Tamara. So my name is Pierre Tanguay. I work on the industry research partnerships of the CMF. And for participants joining us today with visual impairment, I am a white person with short gray hair, big glasses, and today I'm wearing a dark blue jacket with bright red buttons. So yes, for the applications for research more specifically, I think the structure is quite similar to what Tamara just described for the other components of the program. So again, we're asking applicants to talk about the expected results of their research. So what are the impacts that you're seeking to achieve or facilitate with the research that you'll be undertaking? As well, a description of the research project itself and its methodology. We understand, of course, you might not have all the answers at the time of application. So, of course, provide as much details as you can and explain how you're going to go about, preparing the methodology a bit later down the road, if that's the case. Description of the audiences your research project is intended for and which audiences it will benefit. And here is a bit of a different element. We ask you to talk a little bit about the release and distribution plan for your research report or your research publication. So how you intend to release, reach out to the stakeholders, et cetera. Also, similar to the other components, how you plan to go about evaluation and reporting. So how will you monitor the impact of your research publication once it's released? And again, a description of your timeline and your project team. For the project team, same thing. You might not have all the answers. The whole team might not be ready at the time of application. But again, just explain how you will go about sort of recruiting the rest of your team for the project. We also ask you to clarify the IP ownership of the research report. So just to be clear, who will be the organization that owns the IP of the research. So again, there's a detailed document in the application form that explains and provides a lot of details and examples on how to fill out the research applications. So please do have a look at that document if you wish to submit a research application. And my colleague, Emily Skogard, who is here with us today, is also the point person. If you have any questions, her email address is in the application form. So you can please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to answer you.
Great, thank you, Pierre. So I'm going to just go over the last few slides here. As I had mentioned earlier on, there are templates both for the narrative questions in your application and also for the budget. And the budget has tabs, so you fill out the budget depending on the component you're applying to, be that the capacity building, the market access, or the research. I'm also flagging here that you can charge an administrative overhead on your project costs or on your travel costs, should there be some within the costs you're putting forward. This is really because we don't want to see all of the small minor details of your accounting and the proration of how many pieces of paper you're using and your shipping costs and all these sort of tiny administrative things related to running the project. So we have made that allowance here in the budget template. You can also put in staff costs because we know that some organizations will prorate an amount of their staff cost into managing a project. If you're doing it, it's fine, but you have to give us detailed notes on who that person is and how much of their time is being allocated back towards this project. So that's why the budget notes are there. And this may be something that you also want to provide more details with within the narrative of the application when you're talking about your project team. And again, here, I think the devil is always in the details, and we like details. So if you have travel costs, don't just lump in and say 15,000. Tell us, this is 15 people who are flying and each flight is $1,000, and that's how you got to this, or this is a projection of X number of people for X number of nights in a hotel, which you're saying is going to be 150, because otherwise when people put in these sort of rounded numbers, we have no idea how you've gotten to that calculation. And that's going to cause us issues and confusion when we're trying to adjudicate your file. So please give us those details. And the same when you get into the project costs. Of course, project costs will be different for each project depending on the nature of expenses that you have. Often for training projects, you may be paying out an honorarium fee to trainers. You may be paying out an honorarium to people who are being mentored. You may have some venue or equipment supply costs, communication costs. All of those things are fine. We just want you to really give us the breakdown of how you got to those numbers. And I think always do this sort of check at the end of writing your application to make sure that the costs you've put in here and the budget notes relate back to something you've talked about in the narrative of the application. If you're telling us you're renting a room for 5 days and we've never heard mention of anything that was in person in your narrative application, or seen, when that 5-day workshop happens in your schedule, it's going to cause us confusion and people to this. And this is why I'm pointing this out. So write your application, fill out your budgets, take a day and come back and look at it to make sure that all those things link up cleanly. Diego, can we go to the next slide, please? And again, revenue. So because the CMF will only fund a maximum of 75% of the costs, we do want to understand where those other costs are being funded by and what the status is of those funders, and also what type of financing it is. So that's what this portion of the budget template is for. Diego, can we go to the next slide? Great. So this is the contact email if you have questions. When you're ready to send in a letter of intent, this is also the email address we'll receive it from. And again, I'm hoping that someone can put into the chat the link on the CMF website to the application forms. I would suggest, even if you're thinking about putting in a letter of intent, to start by reading through everything, read through the full program guidelines, look at the templates, both for the narrative and for the budget application, so that you have a good understanding of the entire scope of the program. And as Pierre and I have mentioned, feel free to email us at any time for other elements of clarity. But right now we're happy to perhaps, Diego, take down this slide deck and see if we have any questions here in the room. And I'll remind you, if you do have a question, you can use the Q&A chat, the Q&A function here to raise your question so that we can see it there.
No questions so far, Tamara. Very clear.
I'm sure there's something I wasn't clear on, but we will see. We'll give people a few seconds to collect your thoughts.
Tamara, we have a question here. Can the 25% be contributed by the applicant?
Yes. So the 25% can be, it could be your organization's money that you're putting into the thing, or it could be coming from a third party. I think the area I would always be careful with, while it's not disallowed in our application guidelines, is in-kind contributions, because sometimes those don't really have a legitimate value. So we're really going to prioritize when we're reviewing and scoring projects that have that other 25% or 50%, perhaps if the budget is really high and beyond the financing capabilities of the CMF, to actual cash contributions would be more highly regarded, I would say, when we're adjudicating.
And we have another question here. In next year's application, can we repeat some elements of the previous year's program?
Yeah, so I think for organizations that are doing a project that may be a returnable thing that you're going to do year in and year out, as long as that type of project is still eligible within this year's guidelines for sector development, I would have no problem with people coming back in to deliver the same thing again. But I think if you're coming in and asking us for a renewal on your funding for the same project, or if this is a project that you've been doing previously and perhaps the CMF didn't support it, it's really important in the application to talk about the successes from the past editions of the program, perhaps what you've learned and what you're tweaking or improving for this new version of the program.
We have another question here. So I'm assuming third-party financial contributions are more highly regarded than an applicant's contribution. I think you should have answered that a little bit, no?
Yeah, I think if it's your own cash contribution from your organization, from your reserve, or from some money you have from other revenue sources, that's fine. I think that the emphasis is really on the cash contribution versus the in-kind. And I see that Diego has put the links to the program in the chat. And you can find also in those documents our email addresses as well for further support. I'm wondering if there's any other questions in the room, or if people are very shy and quiet today, that's also okay. Or this means we've answered everything, and Pierre, we can congratulate ourselves for trying to explain everything so clearly.
Maybe just mention we'll be having a similar session tomorrow in French. So tomorrow, April 26th at 1 p.m. for those interested. Just one more question now.
Tamara, we have another question here. If the applicant's letter of intent is not approved, does the applicant have the opportunity to revise it and resubmit?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on why the applicant's letter of intent was not approved. If it's that, the thing is not eligible within sector development, if it's out of scope, then that wouldn't be something that the applicant would be revising. If we've given feedback that perhaps says, this needs a little bit more pre-development work to understand, you need to go out and do more of a needs assessment or have more details on how the thing will work, then certainly we would communicate that back to the applicant so that they could consider applying to a future deadline. Any final questions? Or any final comments, perhaps from the team at the CMF? If not, then maybe we can end early. And as I said, we're happy to receive questions and any further clarification over email after this. Great. So I thank everyone for joining, and you have back an extra 15 minutes of your day.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.